Thank you for tuning in to the Electric Church Podcast. My name is Craig. I'm the founder of the Electric Church Podcast. So this is a conversation I had with a gentleman named Pete. And this conversation went really, really long. And we had some technical difficulties getting it onto GarageBand with 2 microphones. So I ended up using some different software and having to manually transfer it. And then I found that GarageBand didn't really like me doing files over 2 hours and 15 minutes. And due to a technical error and human error on my part, I lost like the last 8 minutes or so of the conversation, which is really unfortunate, but I still want to get the conversation out there, obviously, and we'll have Pete on again to dive deeper into some of these subjects that we touch on. And the other problem I had is it didn't really like my file being over 2 hours long. So I ended up splitting the conversation into 2 parts, and I am going to do that from now on. I'm going to make sure I take a break and start a new file and release these long podcasts in 2 halves. It just makes recording easier, it makes post-production easier, it makes uploading easier. So that's the way we'll be doing it from now on. I'm going to have to split this conversation in the file itself. It is one long file, so it's going to be an abrupt conversation halt and then pick up back on the next podcast. But anyways, all that's probably more than you really need to know because you've heard conversations before or you've heard podcasts before. Anyways, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring this podcast to you. It is brought to you by Chameleon Cafe. They're located off Highway 371 next to Brainerd International Raceway. You can stop by there and get the best breakfast, tacos, and sandwiches in the Lakes area. They are open Wednesday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., and Sundays, they are open from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m., and they are closed on Mondays and Tuesdays. Those are the winter hours after Mother's Day. They will be on summer hours and open 7 days a week. But those are the current hours as I record this podcast. So again, this is going to be split into 2 parts. They'll be out several days apart. But here is part 1 of my conversation with Pete Carpentier. All right. Thank you for tuning in to the Electric Church Podcast. Pete, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I am Pete Carpentier.
Tell us as much or as little about yourself as you want.
Well, I guess I would say in terms of anything relevant to what we're talking about today, I career-wise have worked about 10 years in corrections and about 10 years in mental health / social services. Currently work with an elder disabled population, and I also do some homelessness advocacy.
All right. So we kind of had you in here today to talk some government policy with us. So we had a pretty good conversation going before we started messing around with the audio, which gave us all sorts of trouble. So we got a late start, but you want to sort of pick up wherever it is you want to pick up at?
Sure. I guess we were sort of talking about maybe some libertarian philosophies and sort of regulation, in how personal choice is something that I think we both advocate, but also that there is a recognition that we do need to have some regulation, because there's not always, players in situations that are going to look out for the greater good. I was sort of thinking on my way over here, and I know you're probably a little bit of a nerd like I am in some ways, and not that I'm a big uber Star Trek-y guy, but I think sort of a lot of the overall philosophy that you see expressed in the various Star Trek iterations, that we're looking for the greater good overall, and understanding again that they're not always players that are interested in that, and it's more about self-enrichment than it is about creating a society that benefits the whole. Not that I'm the Borg by any means. We don't want to assimilate everyone,
right.
but because I think that there's that balance of individuality that is so important to just having variety in cultural things. I mean, you're a guy that works in the restaurant industry, and to me, variety is amazing. Like the different cultures that have come to our country and contributed to the variety that we have available to us now, I think is just invaluable. Because look at like Applebee's, right? And so to me, Applebee's is standard Americana, right? And not that there's anything against it. I like a good burger, not that they have one, but the standard American fare is pretty boring, and it's pretty bland, and you forever here in the Brainerd area, you could not really find anything that deviated from that norm, and it's so boring, right? So like a while back, I discovered pho, right, which is like a bowl of happiness, and it's so simple. And it's like not good cuts of meat or anything. It's just it's stuff that was born of poverty and necessity, but because those people, that's all they had, they knew how to make it good, And I know you're an Anthony Bourdain fan, and obviously Mr. Bourdain was into that whole philosophy. It's like, make it good, regardless of what the ingredients are. And I think that really exemplifies the contribution of a multicultural society, is make it good.
Yeah.
And so I guess as an overriding thing with that, we look at so recently, right, Beltrami County, I assume you've sort of followed that whole process of their
No, I did not.
Okay. So they recently voted, because the Trump administration stated that for refugee resettlement within the United States, that local governments would have to agree to have refugees resettled in their areas. Now, so the Walz administration on a state level said Minnesota would be open to continued refugee resettlement, which obviously the concentration of that tends to be in the St. Cloud area is a big piece, and also the metropolitan area. Now, Beltrami County, which is the Bemidji area, really has not had any significant refugee resettlement in the last several decades, but their county commissioners came together and had a 3-2 vote stating that they would not support refugee resettlement in their area. And there was a couple of pictures in like the Star Tribune and what have you of the crowd, and it was a lot of 70-plus-year-old men in their MAGA hats and all that stuff with really grumpy looks on their faces and what have you. And I think, when I look at something like that, there are multiple issues when you look at like refugee resettlement, and I think that it often gets confused with what a lot of folks would purport to be illegal immigration, and I certainly understand people not wanting to be supportive of people entering our country without the legal right to do so and what have you and that kind of thing. But when you're looking at refugee resettlement, these are people from countries that are war-torn that have applied for and received refugee status within the United States. And, whether or not you're real supportive of the culture that they come from, they have legally gone through the process that the United States requires for you to move here. And to shut that out and say we don't want that in our community, I think is rather short-sighted in the fact that, again, adding to the diversity of the community, while it sometimes might be uncomfortable, oftentimes can lead to some tremendously positive impacts in the community. And I think, the folks that in Beltrami County, we're looking at it strictly on an economic basis, and there is some support that goes to refugee resettlement, and there can be some costs, I believe, associated with that. But again, when you look at it from more of like a cost-benefit analysis, like not only are we helping to maybe support these folks, but what are they doing to help us? And I think in terms of like social programs that we look at from the government, so many times people either demonize or support those programs based on very little knowledge of how they actually operate. People tend to throw out this generic term of welfare. And when I'm confronted with that, I often like to ask them, well, define to me what is welfare? Because I work in social services, and a lot of my clients receive benefits from programs that might be considered welfare, but people often don't know how those programs actually operate. For the most part, the understanding that a lot of the general public has is like, oh, well, you just go down to the office and you pick up your free money, right? I mean, you probably don't have that understanding because you think about things and you research things. But so what I often do when I'm confronted with folks that have those thoughts, I will bring to the table stories of individuals that I've worked with over the 20 or so years that I've been doing this kind of work. And often the response when I bring a personal story is, oh, well, no, I'm not talking about those people. And what I want to say is, you know what, that's exactly who you're talking about. I work with people who have disabilities, okay? I mean, a person who has an IQ of 55 and schizophrenia. She's really unable to work.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And so is it okay to just leave that person out in the woods with no resources and no ability to care for herself? Or do we as a society say, you know what, we take care of our people, and I think there have been a lot of people from Gandhi to other political leaders that have been sort of credited with the concept of, how we treat the lowest caste of our society is really how we should be judged. And I think even religious folks, there's been some Jesus attribution to that kind of philosophy, as the treat how you treat the least of my people or what have you. And I'm not a particularly religious individual. I was raised in the Catholic Church. I like to consider myself a recovering Catholic, which is sort of code word for atheist. But
that's a good line.
Thank you.
You should sell that to some comedian.
Well, I think it'd be a good T-shirt too.
Ooh,
just
there you go.
Just says recovering
Yeah.
Catholic. I always like conversation starters. I once had a T-shirt that I borrowed from my younger brother, actually, that said "I'm cooler than you."
If you start your own T-shirt company, you really be embracing capitalism,
right?
I would fully encourage this venture.
Well, and I think there's but conversation starters in general, and I think that's kind of like a lot of my philosophy in my personal life is like, because I don't like the kind of BS of just surface level. Like, I live in Brainerd, right? So I can only talk about and listen to people talk about snowmobiling for so much before I just get really bored with it. And not to say that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, I have a motorcycle. I love riding my motorcycle. They're, doing those things are exciting, but it's so kind of base level boring conversationally to me to have that discussion. I mean, let's talk about life. Let's talk about reality. Let's talk about some things. And there's certainly a lot of folks that don't appreciate that level of conversation either.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is I like having interesting conversations about deep subjects.
Absolutely. So.
Yeah. Yeah, let's dive into it. So one of the things we were kind of talking about before we got started was you had mentioned sort of libertarian philosophy and Ayn Rand and sort of this what I would, you said, oh, we'd probably have a different view on that philosophy. And I get like the idea is you kind of implying that that what the philosophy she was going for is greed.
Somewhat.
And see, I think whereas people who lean towards and like that sort of philosophy would call it self-interest. And I think there's a big difference between greed and self-interest.
Certainly.
So, I think that's sort of one of the things how, and I mean, there's, this is where a libertarian or, someone of those sort of values would bring out, sort of all the benefits of capitalism, like, and then, there's usual the retort of, plenty of the bad things of capitalism.
Right.
And I like to always kind of point to is like, sort of, capitalism is able to make these sort of grand accomplishments, like all of the technology that we're using to record this. And when you talk about what I would call like vulturistic capitalism,
Sure.
I would sort of place the blame like on an individual, who's using capitalism in a negative way in that, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that, just like the same way that, there's millions killed in communist Russia and China and all these places, but I wouldn't say that communism killed those people.
Certainly.
I would say that individuals killed those people. Communists killed them.
For sure. So to sort of piggyback on that a little bit, so that, like the 80s film Wall Street, I think, sort of encapsulates that, that Gordon Gekko philosophy of greed is good, and and that's the negative side of it, and I mean I think the philosophy of capitalism in terms of open markets and competitiveness will bring greater achievements to the fold. There is a lot to be said for that. I do think that competition does certainly generate a lot of innovation.
Better product, yeah.
But I think oftentimes when any system is implemented, there can be flaws.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's where I guess a lot of my concerns, if we turn to like the current administration and sort of their philosophy in terms of like trying to eliminate a lot of the environmental protection stuff, I think that eliminating the EPA is maybe not the best way to go about doing things. Are there some EPA standards out there that maybe need to be revisited because we have better science now? I certainly would agree there are. I am not a scientist. I don't know what those things are. But I'm not opposed to people looking at that with, through the lens of, hey, we have better knowledge. My concern typically in our current administration is that they don't, well, at least the head of the administration doesn't do a whole lot through the lens of knowledge. I think he does a lot through the lens of impulse. And that to me is super frightening,
And I am not a fan of tariffs. Tariffs is just a different name for a tax.
Absolutely.
It's messing with the markets. It's basically, saying, oh, well, since American products can't compete as well as these foreign products, we're going to try to manipulate the market to make American products. Not a fan. Not a fan. It doesn't work by any means. It never works. I mean, here we are in a pretty gosh darn good economy. And I can only imagine if somebody would explain how a tariff is just a tax and it doesn't really work. God, I would love to get rid of those.
Well, and it doesn't really work because it's not a tax on the other guy. We end up paying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the Trumponomics, if you will, sort of baffle me. And I'm not an economic scholar by any means. I mean, I like to educate myself, so I read.
I've got a pretty novice understanding of economics. I've read some, sort of economics for dummies sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, he definitely leans like mercantilist, like protecting what's his.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And that I don't. I mean, the fact of the matter is, whether people like it or not, we currently have a global economy.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
you like bananas and coffee,
right?
Me too. They don't grow in Minnesota,
for sure. And I think, again, I'm not a scholar in this by any means, but I think people need to think a little more globally. As in, I mean, the United States, a lot of manufacturing jobs have left for a lot of reasons. I mean, for manufacturing, this is sort of free market capitalism in the grand scheme, is that manufacturers can produce things cheaper elsewhere. And do they want to pay a union worker $30 an hour plus benefits, or do they want to pay some dude down in Mexico $15 a day?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not saying those are the numbers because they're obviously but it's and I saw like the NAFTA trade agreement. I actually had the opportunity to go down to Mexico, and this was during the Obama administration, so no reflection on our current administration, but free market trade areas within Mexico, and I was in Nogales, Mexico, which is a border town, and I had seen some of the ways that, because there was one particular place that was a garage door opener factory that had been an American company, but they'd moved the factory down to Mexico because the labor was cheaper, legit, so they can make their product cheaper, they can provide their product cheaper. We all want cheaper stuff. We go to Walmart, we go shopping. That's how this stuff works, right? And then that place ended up getting shut down and moved to where of all places, China. Because, you know what, labor's even cheaper there. I can make a cheaper product there, too, So, I mean, this sort of unfettered capitalism thing, again, it doesn't always work, because when you're looking, if your corporation's sole motivation is to maximize profits at the cost of the worker, that ends up not working in the long run. I mean, there has to be a balance,
and that's what I would describe as vulturistic capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're being vultures.
Yeah.
That's exploitation is not inherently a part of capitalism,
right? Nor should it be.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's always going to be unsavory characters. So the sort of idea of total free markets and anarcho-capitalism, and that's highly ridiculous to me. Things need to be regulated. I mean, and one of the places where we see issues rise because we've just decided to make it nothing but a black market is, of course, the drug war.
Absolutely.
So. I mean, and we see the problem with that. Just before we were chatting, you were saying that there's apparently rumors or maybe actual reports of people putting fentanyl in marijuana.
Yeah, and it's just, to me, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you look at the war on drugs, such as it is, and I mean, I think this is a topic we could probably do 20 podcasts on because it's pretty deep.
Yeah.
But, it's a culture war. It's a class war. It ain't a war on drugs.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a way. I mean, most prohibition philosophies have not played out well, I think, historically.
Especially not in a nation this size.
Correct.
When you've got a really small nation, it's somewhat doable, but
I mean, I would say the same thing is true of communism. Like, communism isn't a bad idea if you got like an island of 40 people and you can work together.
For sure, yeah.
You got hundreds of millions of folks, and it's just not going to work.
Yeah, for sure.
On that scale. But I mean, so if you look at the drug situation and you look at how things are playing out in certain states that have gone to recreational or whatever cannabis, and said, like the recent situation in Illinois, where you look at the taxation on it, and it's a little difficult because their taxation is almost another set of prohibition.
Yeah.
Because it makes it unaffordable for people. I mean, so if I can go to the weed guy down the street and get an eighth for $50, versus going to the dispensary and my eighth is $70 plus another $40 in tax. I'm like, on the economics of it, it's like, why would I go to the dispensary?
For sure.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I think a lot of the philosophy of going to recreational legalization and stuff is to eliminate that black market and those the difficulties that come along with it, the criminalization side of it, the cartel side of it, the fact that even in stuff as simple as weed, stuff gets pretty shady when you have no regulation to it.
Yeah.
And so if you get the government involved and you can do things legally at a dispensary, it still has to be affordable.
Right.
To people, and so there are, I mean, again, really real complexities to all of these issues, and the strong point of eliminating the prohibition of cannabis is to again eliminate the criminal side of it, and you look at all the people who have, because of various laws affiliated with the war on drugs, whether it's a three strikes philosophy or things like that, who maybe have been sentenced to decades in prison for selling weed.
Mm-hmm.
Now maybe they've had some other transgressions in their past, but as I stated at the outset of this podcast, I spent 10 years working in corrections, and if that taught me anything, it's that people make mistakes, and it doesn't make them bad human beings. I mean, there are so many people. If you look at the Crow Wing County in custody list, I would bet you that at least 85% of the people in custody are there because of a chemical dependency issue, not because of a direct criminal problem.
Sure. Yeah, victimless crime.
But oftentimes, I mean,
it leads to real crime.
Correct.
Yeah.
There will be, perhaps, property crimes where somebody's stolen some property or things like that related to feeding whatever habit they've engaged in over time, or it's DWIs and things like that. And, I mean, we certainly, I don't encourage people to get all drunked up and start driving. Nobody wants to support that. And I don't think people should, smoke a giant bong hit and get behind the wheel either. Right. I mean, I don't think that's a good plan.
Impaired driving is impaired no matter what you're
correct.
On.
Yeah. And nobody wants to see that.
You shouldn't be driving on,
too. Goodness. Yeah. And those things, and that's the odd thing, if you look at the opioid crisis, a lot of that, I mean, and it's come to the forefront primarily because it's hit the non-ethnic community, if you will. I mean, white people every single day are being prescribed opioids. It does impact communities of color at a far greater level, but it was interesting. I actually went to a nationwide summit on opioid use disorders a couple of summers ago in Atlanta, and former President Clinton actually was one of the speakers that I got to see there. And, he talked about a little bit how the opioid crisis had touched him, and then one of his neighbor's sons had overdosed popping pills and drinking beer at a college party and died. And that's one of those things is it becomes, when heroin was a big deal in the 30s and 40s and it was primarily people of color who were dying, it was less of an issue. But as it's creeped into suburbia and, people who have greater representation in government, if you will, all of a sudden it's at the front door of what people are talking about. And again, these are issues we could probably disseminate.
Right.
For,
we'll have you back on. Don't worry.
Yeah. But I mean, and it's an interesting aspect to my job, right? Because I work in a social services, and again, I'm not going to name my employer, but I work in a community that has been marginalized forever. And so working in a ethnic community that's marginalized, that lives in poverty and doesn't have a lot of resources, man, really opens your eyes to a lot of things that maybe I grew up in Brainerd. My dad's a lawyer. My mom was a nurse, man. I'm like the poster boy for middle-class white America. I was sheltered growing up. I didn't know anything of any of these topics. I really didn't until I got into it. And while it doesn't necessarily impact me directly in my life, it certainly impacts the work that I do and the humans that I work with on a level that has just really made me far more cognizant of the issues. So, it's real easy, I think, in a lot of ways to sort of, well, that doesn't impact me, so I'm not going to worry about it. And I totally understand that, because this is not stuff that's fun to think about necessarily, or fun to try to solve. But man, I'm a huge fan of former Senator Paul Wellstone in a lot of ways. And particularly, though, the one quote that always sticks out to me is that we all do better when we all do better. And I don't think that is a partisan philosophy at its core. Mm-hmm. As an overriding thing, what I like to see in that is that it's right, man. If you're doing better, I'm doing better. People are coming into your cafe and spending money. Yeah. People are contributing to society, man. We're all enriched when people around us are more successful.
For sure.
So label that what you will, but I think there are many different philosophies that can approach that. And we may have different ways of achieving that goal, and I think we should explore those ways. I will always admit that I don't know everything. Right. I do not have the answers. I recognize a lot of the problems, but I'm not saying that I have the answers. And I think in life, like so many things, we want to achieve some balance. My way of approaching a problem may not be the most practical in all terms. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of this, because I'm a person who supports a lot of social programs, and a lot of those programs can be very expensive. I think my personal philosophy is that long term they pay off. And long term, it's an investment in the community that not only pays off, but then can be reduced over time.
Yeah, I think we can, one of the things that you can definitely see that there was a huge impact on was the closing of so many mental institutions.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes. I think the homeless situation that we're experiencing, and my daughter lives in Alaska, and so usually once a year I fly up to get her, and this last year I arrived late at night, but it's the beginning of the summer, so the sun never goes down.
Sure.
So it's like 9 o'clock, but it's still pretty gosh darn light out, and there's just a footpath from the airport, and there's a sign that says, boom, downtown, and sure. So I'm following this paved footpath, boom, from the airport to downtown, and we get to there's it goes under a tunnel, under a road, and there's like a clover leaf around the highway, and when I get through the tunnel, I'm in a homeless camp.
Oh, yeah.
Right there on the side of the highway next to the airport, and they were just everywhere. Mm-hmm. Before I even got close to downtown, I wandered into sort of dangerous situation. I had to wander my way back out of there.
I have no doubt.
It was insane. You speak about, yeah, when you cut some of these problems, or cut the problem doesn't go away.
Right.
So, focus on to sort of draw into one sort of topic at all, if you wouldn't mind. Universal base income. Obviously Andrew Yang is
Yep.
on the campaign trail now. I heard an interview on him. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Sure.
And I like Yang quite a bit. And I'm not completely opposed to UBI as it's called. I don't necessarily like his entire approach to it, which is basically like everybody gets $1,000, up to $1,000.
Right.
If you're already getting, some social programs, those are all subtracted from that total. He lumps Social Security into that, which I'm not a fan of at all.
Sure.
And I'm not totally for or against UBI. I'm kind of on the fence on it. I definitely see it as something that can be beneficial. I also am deeply concerned about the amount of debt and deficit we have, so I am also worried about the price tag on it.
For sure.
But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm kind of on the fence on it.
Well,
why don't you give us your take on it?
Well, and that's interesting because as it turns out, and this will probably give away some idea as to who my employer is, I work for a government that does provide universal basic income to its members, and they get $933 a month, which is pretty darn close to Mr. Yang's $1,000 a month. And I'm going to tell you straight up that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
However, caveats to that. It doesn't work in the sense that it's meant to be a supplement to income, and so often people do not utilize it in that way. They just try to live on it. So $1,000, I couldn't live on it. And this is where some sort of the concept of capitalism and competitiveness and competitive employment comes to the forefront to say that, all right, if you do not incentivize people to do some sort of something with their lives, if they come from this poverty situation where because in social work there's a concept called a culture of poverty. So it's generational oftentimes, and in the where I work, there are more components to it, like a lot of historical trauma and things like that also impact.
Yeah.
A lot of domestic violence, a lot of chemical use. It's really overwhelming when you look at it as a whole.
Sure.
But I can tell you that giving people that money, it's just enough money to keep you out of some other benefits. It's not enough money to live on. And if it were utilized, like I said, again, as an income supplement to help lift people up out of poverty, that philosophy I would be on board with. But again, unfortunately, so many folks don't operate in that mindset. They go, because it's that dollar amount per individual who's an adult. So if you have, say, a married couple, or even if it doesn't matter if they're married, I guess, if you have two of those incomes, you now have a little over $1,800 a month. And then, start throwing some kids in the mix and that kind of thing, and maybe some subsidized housing and whatever. It's a perpetual cycle of poverty that people remain in. Now, this is where you look at the individual choice and things like that. And we encourage people to go out and get a job, but they're in a community where there are very few jobs available. And people don't want to leave the community because that's where their family is and what few resources they have. And so I understand why people don't want to leave. But like I said, it's like just enough money to keep you broke.
Sure.
And again, I don't want to say that I'm against the concept either, because if it were utilized again, as a supplement, I think we could benefit so many people. However, in so many of these things, I think I'm a Bernie Sanders guy, okay, and I don't think that necessarily all of Bernie's things are going to work, because when people want to put forth a policy, often it's that utopian version of their policy. And if we implement this, if it goes the way we expect it to go, this is what the end result will be.
Yeah.
If there's anything that I've learned in my line of work, is that nothing ever works out the way you think it's going to.
Right? Yeah. Well, yeah. I think that's one of the things. And I mean, well, I think it's normal for politicians to always paint their policy in the best light. You're not going to be like, oh, well, this might go wrong and that might go wrong. You're just going to be like, hey, this is going to work. It's going to be great. But sort of staying in this vein of UBI, yeah, I think I know Norway, they get like oil dividends, the money that comes out, and in Alaska they get the same thing. They get like oil dividends. They get one big lump, and yeah, I think maybe it's set up a bit differently. Well, for one thing, the way it's structured, the payouts, so you can't necessarily live off it.
Right.
But yeah, I think it was Sweden that tried to model that for like long-term unemployed people. They had put them on this sort of universal base income, and they ended up scrapping it after 2 years because they found it completely ineffective. That I think the people on the program, like, I think they just ended up, more of them ended up using drugs than were before, or something. Like it literally, like you said, it just sort of led to this perpetual poverty. Like,
and another instance of this is I had a client.
So I find that just interesting that it works in some places, in some structures, and other places it doesn't work at all. And maybe it's the structure, maybe it's the community itself.
Well, so on this, so like supplemental security income is part of disability for people who haven't had enough work credit in their history to qualify for disability. So if you're legally and medically disabled, this is the extra. This is the amount of money that you get to live on, and it's $700 and some odd a month. It's not very much money, but I had a client, mid-50s, right, and she's schizophrenic. Paranoid schizophrenia, very symptomatic. Lived on her own, but she never really left the house much. So she's in a subsidized house, like a Section 8 kind of a situation where she only pays a third of her income, and then she probably gets some food support too and whatever. And so one of her goals that we were working on in terms of her mental health was getting out more, and we wanted her to try to get a job. She hadn't worked in decades, right? So, back during the Clinton administration, they'd done some reforms to these programs to try to help wean people off of the programs. And it was sort of what they had at that time called workfare versus welfare. And so the point is that when you start earning an income, when you're on supplemental security income, as you earn $1, essentially they take $1 away from your benefit. Not a bad idea on paper necessarily, because that theoretically should put you at about the same amount of income, right? And then it's supposed to work people toward greater levels of independence. Now, again, the implementation piece of this that is difficult is, so my client, now after decades of not working, and we're working with her, we're working on goals, and we're helping her make some applications. She lives in Brainerd, and she gets a job cleaning cabins up in Cross Lake. She's excited about this because she hasn't done this for so long, right? And so she now has to drive from Brainerd to Cross Lake. She has to buy some clothing to work in, and some other things like that. So there's some initial expenditures there, and so she starts going up to her employer, and she's doing real well. And as an added benefit to this, she comes to me one day and she says, "You know what? That job's pretty hard on me physically."